Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to give it another 30 seconds or so and let others join, and then we'll get started. Okay, why don't we get started? Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar um, on our new report, our new IMM guide, Ventures at the Helm, how ventures and investors can navigate impact measurement and management together. We have a lot in store for you today. Some of you have seen this report, and many of you might not have. So we're going to introduce you to some of the findings from this practice research that we've done over the last year or so. And we'll talk a little bit about what our objectives were, what we found, and then introduce you to some of the tools and practices that we hope will be helpful for you. We know there's a range of different people here in the audience and organizations, including ventures, investors, as well as practitioners. And so we have something in store for all of you in order to be able to make your work around impact measurement and management hopefully a little bit easier in your day to day. So, just a couple of quick housekeeping things before we jump into the content. As you'll see, the webinar is being recorded. We encourage you to submit your questions via Q&A throughout. If we can pick them up during our slides and session at the first half, we'll do that. Otherwise, we have time in the second half to respond to all of your questions. So please submit as we go. We're also going to have a couple of polls. So we'd encourage you to participate and share your perspectives around how you engage with these issues around impact measurement and management that we'll talk about. We often get this question, so we know that you're all interested in the slides. They will be available post-session. About a week after this session, we're going to send you both the recording as well as the slides. And we'll be pasting the link already. I think it might be there in the chat. This is the link to where you can download the full report and the findings at immjourney.com. So I'm pleased to be co-hosting this with two of my co-authors on the report and fellow guest faculty at the Oxford Impact Measurement Program. So by way of introduction, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Karim. I'm the Program Director of the Oxford Impact Measurement Program. I'm joined by Penny Hawkins, who is an independent consultant, co-author on the report with us, as well as most recently, former head of evaluation for DFID. We're also joined by Laura Bedzina, also co-author on the report. You're going to hear from both of them fairly soon. Laura was most recently at MIT's D-Lab. All three of us bring perspectives as evaluators, as practitioners. We've worked both with ventures as well as with investors. And as you'll see when we cover the different parts of this report, we're trying to speak to different parts of the ecosystem around impact measurement and management, but also trying to make some of the findings that we heard from how ventures navigate IMM and how investors support IMM into very practical guidance and advice. So we hope that this isn't just a report that you'll read, but also one that you can actually use in your day-to-day, and we'll explain how you could do that. So in terms of our coverage today, we'll introduce the guide quickly. We'll also talk a little bit about why framing and reframing perhaps impact measurement and management is important, because we think that that's been part of the challenge and perhaps gotten in the way of some of the more interesting ways to approach IMM. We'll then preview some of the phases of the impact creation journey by looking at the stories of ventures and what they told us around how they've navigated the opportunities, the challenges, and the various inflection points around how they think about what impact measurement and impact management look like in practice. We'll then preview again some of the worksheets for ventures. How do ventures figure out what phase they're in? How do they anticipate and think about the kinds of tools and approaches and choices that they're making? And then in the next section, we'll look at how investors and practitioners can support ventures on that journey. And we'll also cover the worksheets that are specific to investors, including how to think about their preferences and needs and the different ways that they can support ventures in their portfolio. So let's start out by actually giving you a representative example of things that we've heard fairly often, not only through the course of this research, but in our work as practitioners in this field, which really illustrate the kind of motivation and goals that we had for why we think this kind of work matters. So Laura, over to you.
Thanks so much, Karim, and hello, everyone. So I'll start by telling you a story about the first venture we interviewed for this project. And that was Sabrina Habib, who is the co-founder of Kidogo, which is a venture based in Kenya that provides childcare for young children in the Nairobi area. And she told us that 6 months into Kidogo's existence, they had this amazing opportunity. They received a large grant to really kickstart their business. And without this grant, Sabrina says, Kidogo would not have been able to continue. But there was a catch. This grant came with a requirement to run a very rigorous, very intensive case-controlled study to measure the effect of Kidogo's childcare model on long-term child development. They took it on, and you'll see what happens next in this quote. We were still in prototyping phase and iterating, but the research required things to stay stagnant so that we could measure the change over time. Our model stalled for 2 years because we couldn't change anything. Later in the interview, Sabrina reflected, and she said, at times, it might be more important to prioritize iteration and innovation than it is to prioritize research. Where we are right now, we are absolutely needing some type of rigorous independent impact measurement, but we were not at that place 7 years ago. This story luckily has a happy ending. Once this study finally wrapped up and Kidogo was free to start iterating and trying new things, they didn't simply abandon impact measurement altogether. They just started measuring different things that were more relevant to the questions at hand. So they started measuring things like parent satisfaction with their model. They measured things like the quality of the different childcare centers that were being set up in neighborhoods around Nairobi. This allowed them to get rapid feedback and iterate. And essentially, as soon as they were able to measure those things, instead of these more intensive long-term studies, the model took off, and they've since become the largest player in this space in the region. So Sabrina's story got us thinking. And as we heard more and more stories like Sabrina's, we began to see this pattern of ventures experiencing this iterative ebb and flow process and adjusting their measurement to the most important questions at hand. So that really gave us the metaphor of a sailor captaining a ship on the open sea. And as conditions change, sailors adjust their sails and direction. They increase or decrease their speed. They drop anchor. Maybe they change their route altogether. And critically, a technique that is right for one phase of the journey will be wrong or possibly even harmful at a different phase. The autonomy to act and adapt is critical. So this guide that we'll be sharing with you today is really our salute to the captains of those ships. And we're really trying to reimagine IMM as something where these captains have the flexibility to answer the most important questions at hand. So first and foremost, this guide is for those ventures, so they can learn from journeys, the IMM journeys of other ventures like them. They can identify the phase that they're in and the most appropriate IMM tools for that phase, and they can be empowered to make the choices and advocate for the ability to make those choices.
Thanks, Laura. And this guide is also for investors. And we know that investors are thinking about the ways in which IMM can deliver more value. They are keen to support their ventures to realize fully the impact expectations and goals that they have, but also they have their own needs and expectations around IMM and are looking for ways to maximize those, ways that are perhaps are simpler and more appropriate than perhaps they have in the past.
We also realize that practitioners have a role in this, and that they understand how to ask the questions. They also can help with understanding the context and support the choices that both ventures and investors face in these market-based settings, and promote better practice in IMM.
So you'll see that as we go along in the presentation, that we have specific tools for ventures as well as investors and practitioners, but we wanted to introduce you first to some of the findings from each of these different types of ventures that we've surveyed. But before that, we wanted to hear a little bit from you, because we know that there's a range of experience across this audience around your engagement with impact measurement and management. So we just wanted to, because we've heard versions of that story that Laura outlined from Kidogo and Sabrina, we want to understand whether you've heard versions of that story. So our poll, if we can just launch that, please, Darius, is: does IMM provide value, or to what extent do you think that current approaches to IMM provide value to ventures? You may be working directly with ventures or supporting them, and we've got 5 options here. Provides a lot of value, provides some value, is distracting or not valuable, depends on the situation, or you may be unsure how to respond given the options or if this topic is new to you. So we'll leave it open for another 20 seconds or so and see where we land, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of these responses and what we heard from ventures themselves. Okay, I think we've gotten most people who've responded, so maybe we can close and share the poll. Okay, fascinating. Thanks, Darius. So we can see that IMM provides some value has come out as the top response from this group, but equally, a lot of value and depends on the situation have had a fairly, about a quarter of you have responded. And I think we're picking more than, or we're selecting just one. So yeah, it's a very interesting split. We've heard, funnily enough, the one that was the lowest here, that it could be distracting or not valuable, much more in previous sessions than we've heard here. And unsure how to respond, we'd love to hear from you around those that picked that option, why you said that. So in the Q&A, as we're going along in this next section, we're going to talk a little bit about what we heard from ventures. And we'd love to hear your reactions and how much of that resonates with you. But it is interesting for many of us, we do stay in this bucket around IMM providing some value. And really one of our motivations was, could IMM provide more value? And in what ways could that happen? What would it take? And how to do it and how to support that well. So just as a brief overview of our origin story, we know, and for those of you that have attended any of our prior webinars, there is growing interest and activity in impact measurement and management. When we're operating in market-based approaches, this is still not particularly easy or straightforward. And we've heard that from ventures in particular, that there's a desire for more value from all the work that they do around collecting and analyzing and reporting data. They also understand that their journey, as Laura described, is non-linear, and so they may require a degree of flexibility and autonomy as they go, rather than a fairly prescriptive approach to IMM. And they're also keen to have more proportionality, and that they want to make sure that depending on the stage they're in, that the amount of work and time and effort and questions relate quite closely to the kinds of goals that they have. We also know from our work with investors that they are seeking more utility from IMM. They also want to be clear about what to measure and what to focus on. And increasingly, there are questions around impact claims and impact integrity. So some of those are quite similar to ventures, but also quite different. And then as practitioners, even as experienced evaluators, we continue to ask questions around what are the range of tools and approaches we could use? How do we adapt some of the classic tools from monitoring and evaluation into market-based approaches? Are there new tools and approaches that we should be thinking about? So generally the question is, what does that toolkit look like? And we hope that we've compiled at least a version of that for all of you today. So we started by asking ventures that we knew had gone through various parts of this journey by asking some of these questions around how do they think about measurement? Have they evolved their approaches? And what have they learned about what's worked or not worked? And then we also asked a range of impact investors and practitioners around what they were doing, seeing, or hoping to do more of around IMM. And so this is the compilation really of a lot of those perspectives. As you can see, we interviewed quite a range of ventures as well as ecosystem interviewees. And when we had the first draft of our report, we invited comments from a range of IMM practitioners as well as investors and ventures. And so we're very grateful for all those perspectives because we think that that has really strengthened the guide, but also has made it much more applicable to the day-to-day work across a range of different contexts. So I'll quickly summarize the front end of this work, and there's a lot more for those of you that are new to IMM around how we think the traditional framing of IMM perhaps is not as helpful as a framing of IMM that is a bit more dynamic and appropriate for the times we find ourselves in. To summarize, the classic framing of IMM has tended to emphasize technical issues. It has tended to focus quite specifically around how to look at reporting, perhaps, how to look at upward accountability, how to focus on precision. It has also tended to be much more static. It's assumed that you can pick a set of metrics or approaches at one point, and then those will remain consistent over time. And it's also implicitly or explicitly assumed that there's linearity, whether it's in cause-effect or that simply as a venture scales, that it will just get more complex and rigorous in terms of its IMM. We heard a very different story, as Laura said, from ventures when we asked them, what does IMM actually look like in practice and what does it need to look like? And so triangulating the experiences of both ventures as well as practitioners and investors in the field that are trying some new things, we wanted to reframe IMM in terms of these three different and alternative frames of IMM as strategic, so thinking about it not necessarily as being overly technical, but that there is a degree of linkage with the venture's visibility and control over impact and how it evolves over time. It's adaptive, that we recognize that, as Laura said, that the venture journey actually is quite dynamic, and therefore that the IMM approaches and context should be too. And that is iterative, in that there isn't necessarily a kind of linear approach around the scaling journey in the way that we might have anticipated before, but there are lots of ebbs and flows. Sometimes measurement looks quite simple, even if you are a quite mature organization. Sometimes it's quite sophisticated, even if you're an early stage organization. And so that was a little counterintuitive when we heard about what the venture journeys actually look like and what we might have anticipated if we looked at maybe a more classic version of what a venture scaling journey would be. And we've included a couple of quotes here. We've peppered some of these throughout the entire guide so you can see how different funders, practitioners, and ventures interpret some of the themes. Unsurprisingly, there is a fascination with metrics in this space, and sometimes that gets in the way because particularly for ventures that are trying new things, it can be very difficult to pick the right metrics at the front end of your journey. But also, as you'll see, we need to spend a lot more time thinking about how we use data to make better decisions rather than just thinking about how we collect data. And so that's a theme around how we use data for decision making that we'll come back to relatively regularly. So why don't I hand it over to Laura now to take us through the phases of the impact creation journey. And here we've shared and constructed a framework to allow ventures to think about some of the ways in which they can situate the approaches and choices around IMM for them.
Thanks, Karim. So as you can see here, we've deduced or induced, let's say, 4 different phases of the impact creation journey. And this came from speaking to different ventures about their experiences. And this is how really they described what it felt like to be in these different moments as their venture was evolving over time. Now, I want to specify that although here on this particular slide, we've presented these phases in a particular order, what we found is that this is not a linear process. So these 4 phases, we saw examples of them happening in many different orders. We saw examples of ventures returning to some of the same phases over and over. Essentially, if they are out on the open sea, they are reacting to whatever conditions they're up against at that moment. And so this does not correspond, as Karim said, to a sort of linear early stage to scaling type of model, but rather this is iterative and it's more of an ebb and flow. The impact creation journey is not the same thing as a scaling journey. And when we first began this research, we thought we were going to be able to easily map IMM tips and tools to different phases of the classic scaling journey. And what we heard, as Karim said, from the ventures was very different and needed to be much more adaptive and flexible than that. So I'll speak a little bit to each of these phases and what they mean. So the first phase that we heard ventures speak to was the orienting phase. Now, this we describe as an intentional and defined moment of framing and goal setting. Sometimes this happens in a venture's early stage, but it can happen at any point along its journey. It might happen during a strategic planning process. It might happen when a more traditional for-profit company is building out a new impact strategy. So this is really just a pause to reassess goals and to intentionally set them. The second phase we heard ventures describe was navigating. And this we found as a period of exploring a lot of new opportunities, testing hypotheses, trying to try a number of different impact models, as well as impact measurement techniques. This tends to be a kind of high touch period of listening, learning, testing, throwing out ideas, trying new ideas. And sometimes it happens in this in an earlier stage as a venture is seeking proof of concept or product market fit. But this can happen perhaps after a pivot in its later stage when it's faced with a new opportunity or introducing a new product, and it's going back to that more iterative and you could say less stable period of time. We also heard ventures describe a sailing phase, and we've also referred to this as a streamlining phase. During this period, a venture tends to be a little bit more stable in its impact model. And at this point, it's sort of optimizing towards a set of goals. It's often able in this phase to simplify its measurement a little bit. So instead of getting more complex as the venture gets a little bit more stable and sophisticated, at this point, the metrics get a little bit more integrated and built in to the business model or the impact model. And sometimes this is actually characterized by a pulling away from some of the more intensive and rigorous impact measurement strategies that we saw or that we sometimes see in the navigating phase. And then the final phase we heard ventures describe, we referred to as tacking. And tacking is a nautical term for sort of turning rapidly into the wind. We describe this as an intentional, time-limited pivot or an adaptation to a new opportunity, need, or question. Now, this may be the whole ship steering really rapidly to one side or another, such as in the case of COVID, when many business models and impact models had to pivot really quickly. Or it could be that a business is exploring a new opportunity, a new market, a new product, and needs to do a sort of deep dive, answer a deep dive question at that moment. Again, these phases do not have to happen in this order. Most of the time, they don't just happen once. And so we saw examples of ventures passing through all of these phases in different orders and different iterations as their ventures grew and scaled. I'll give you an example. So going back to the story I told earlier in the session about Kidogo, the early childhood education childcare provider in Kenya. During they passed through a navigating phase when they were really trying to understand and solidify their impact model and their business model. And so during that period of time, they had a key question, which was, how are parents experiencing Kidogo's childcare services? And some of the reasons they were in that stage or asking that question is because they were really still developing out their core offering. They hadn't settled on a kind of go-to model that they were offering to parents and children. They were learning about their customers. They were trying to find the product market fit. And so the key question they needed to answer at that stage was, how do parents experience Kidogo's childcare services? This is in stark contrast to the question that their funder wanted them to ask, which is, what is the effect of their model on child development 3-4 years out? What was more immediate for them to survive as a business and to figure out was this question about how parents were experiencing the service. And a couple of years later, they, once their model was a little bit more stable, they had something that was growing quite rapidly and scaling. They had questions about how to actually reduce their costs, but maintain the same level of impact. So they framed to a new question, which was, to what degree can we shorten Kidogo's teacher training program while still preserving the same level of quality and the same type of outcomes that we're seeing? And so this is an optimizing kind of a question. We would characterize this as a scaling or streamlining type of question. They had a stable business model, streamlined operations, and at this point they were seeking expansion. And so this sort of bang for the buck, cost per impact type of question became most top of mind. So now that you've heard a little bit about these 4 different phases, orienting, navigating, sailing, and tacking, we wanted to hear from you which ones of these are resonating at this moment. So if you're a venture, what phase, based on these descriptions, do you think you find yourself in today? And if you're an investor or practitioner, think about the average venture that you work with, or think about one venture in particular, if that's easier. What phase are they in right now? So Darius, if we could launch that poll. Thank you so much.
While we're waiting for responses, thank you for the questions. We're going to pick those up actually fairly shortly, but keep them coming. And it's nice to see that there's quite a range of experience and some really great questions. So thank you, Tanuja, Askar, and Natalia so far for lots of great questions, which we will try and prep some responses to shortly.
And maybe we'll give it another 10 seconds or so. All right, so Darius, whenever you're ready, you can close and share the poll. Thank you so much. Great. So really interesting results. So we see that almost half of you resonated the most with orienting phase, that kind of intentional moment of goal setting, figuring out who are we as a social venture, how are we, and what is the impact we're trying to have, where do we fit into this ecosystem? Followed by a little over a third really felt that the navigating phase resonated. So this testing a lot of hypotheses and testing assumptions and trying a lot of new things at once. And in third place was the sailing phase, this more optimized, streamlined phase, and finally the tacking or pivoting phase. So I think this is really interesting, right? Because what we find in sort of mainstream advice for ventures on how to approach their impact measurement and management, we find that most of the advice out there is very oriented toward a sailing phase. Similarly, most of the expectations that investors and funders place on ventures is associated with a sailing phase, being able to have a series of metrics that you're able to consistently measure over time and optimize for. But as we can see just from this poll, we see a lot of ventures that folks are working with that would have measurement that's more appropriate to match the orienting and navigating phase. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in the following slides. So when you take a look at the guide that we've put together, what we've tried to do for each of these phases is give some really practical examples and practical tips on what to do if you find yourself in this phase. So first, we describe what this phase looks or feels like, a little bit more detail on what are some of the dynamics that a venture is experiencing when passing through that particular phase of a journey. And we share some of the critical IMM questions that might be top of mind for them, as well as some of the factors that have put them in that phase. And from there, we recommend specific tools, approaches, methods, tips on how to do IMM well, how to best serve those questions that are top of mind for the venture at that moment. We also share some common pitfalls, some typical things that go wrong in that moment, whether because of lack of the technical support to do it correctly or because of external pressures that a venture is under. We spotlight a few cases of ventures who have gone through that phase and what it looked like for them. And critically, we give some tips to investors on what are ways they can particularly support ventures who are passing through this phase on their IMM. And in order to do that, we want to pass to the next slide. We've offered a series of worksheets to make this really concrete and practical for different folks, for the ventures themselves and for folks who are working with those ventures. So we have a series of 3 worksheets for ventures. The first worksheet, and this is just the first activity of that first worksheet, is to help ventures situate themselves in the phase that they're in, to help identify by asking themselves a series of questions. Where am I right now? What are the questions that are most important to me? And what are the kind of factors and conditions? Where are the winds blowing on my journey? The second worksheet that we offer, and we can move to the next slide on this one, is an IMM diagnostic. And this is where we help ventures assess whether the impact measurement and management strategies that they're using right now correspond to the phase that they're in, or whether they don't. So we ask a series of questions about what types of things have you tried, and what are some of the challenges you're facing, and what are some of the resources you think you might need given the questions you have. And this can help assess whether your IMM system is aligned with your phase or whether it's the wrong tool at the wrong time. And if we move on to the next slide, I want to make sure that we take away this really, really key message today. So if you take away nothing else from today, we want you to remember this lesson that we learned over the course of our research, which is that when ventures align their IMM approach with the phase they are in and with the questions at hand, IMM drives impact creation. When there is misalignment, IMM hinders impact creation. And for this reason, if a venture has assessed that, hey, I'm in a navigating phase, but my measurement system looks like a sailing phase, they're able to actually come to their funders, their investors, maybe it's their board, maybe it's their leader, and they're able to say, listen, we're out of alignment. And if we can get in alignment, it's going to create value for us and for you. And so the third worksheet that we offer, and I don't have a screenshot of that one today, is actually a script that ventures can use to have this conversation with some of the folks that they're operating with who might help offer the flexibility or the resources for them to get back in sync. So with that, I'll turn it over to how investors can help. Back to you, Karim.
Thanks, Laura. And maybe I'll just go back actually to this slide and to respond to some of the questions that have come in from both Oscar and Tanuja. We're all practitioners. We have experience in a variety of different tools and approaches. But one of the things I think all of us know who've worked in this area is that if you're clear on the kinds of questions, it's much more easier to pick an approach. And when that goes in the wrong order, as Laura was saying, that is one of the causes of misalignment. And then everybody struggles. The venture might feel that, it's too cumbersome. It's not getting them the value they need. The practitioner might feel that, hey, maybe, I need to do more, or I need to do something different because this approach just isn't getting me or the venture what they need. And the investor equally might be frustrated because they might have different expectations around what the approach is going to deliver or even capable of. And so you can see here what we heard from the different ventures. We've tried to organize some of the options in terms of the tools and approaches. Some of those might be familiar to you, others might be new to you. We think that, back to one of the points that Laura made earlier, that autonomy and flexibility are critical. So, another point that we'd want to emphasize from why we structured this guide in this way is that think about IMM as a toolkit rather than a singular approach. And consistent with a lot of what we heard from ventures, often you need a range of approaches, a range of strategies, and the space to be able to think about how those evolve in a much more dynamic and iterative fashion than we perhaps have constructed IMM to think about traditionally. There's a lot of, for example, activity around standards, and we think that those are particularly helpful in some cases. But a lot of what we're talking about really is what impact management is. We know a lot about what measurement looks like, but how do you actually manage for impact, and how do you make it dynamic and appropriate as your venture journey evolves? And so that would be some of the ways I think that this work is somewhat distinctive from some of the other things you might have seen. And also, as we've described, this is a lot of the work that happens before and after ventures pick a specific standard or approach. So we're emphasizing a lot of the factors that get in the way or can enable IMM, and those often are organizational, cultural, political, and not just technical. So one of the to get back to the last part of this report, we heard from a lot of impact investors that are keen to do this to support their ventures in more or different ways. And so we've outlined here a kind of menu or a set of 4 different ways that investors can support their ventures. Often we think about this quite narrowly, just in terms of supporting them financially to, for example, secure some technical advice or assistance. But we believe that impact investors can do much more and often have a very fulfilling and combination of things that they can bring that are non-technical and non-financial to help ventures along that journey. The first is to plan to chart a course together. And we think that a core part of this is that investors themselves can be clear about what questions they have, what preferences and needs they're responding to, either for their investors, depending on whether they're GPs or LPs, and also the ways that they think about how IMM can inform their decisions. And so there are a range of strategies, and we've outlined in some of the worksheets how investors can more explicitly talk about what impact means for them, how do they think about data and measurement, and what would be necessary and sufficient at various stages of the relationship with their ventures. The second is equipping ventures with gear and guides. And here we've outlined a range of ways in which investors can provide both financial and non-financial contributions to improve the capacity and technical capabilities of ventures. And we'll show that in a minute. The third is consistent with the title, Ventures at the Helm. We think that it's important for impact investors of all kinds to defer to the ship's captain. Along the venture journey, as we've described, it is dynamic, it's iterative, and there are a number of ways that investors can be helpful and respond to some of the choices and inflection points along the venture journey, and to recognize that the questions that ventures ask at each of those stages might not be the same as the questions that investors ask, but over time, they can be much more consistency and alignment when approaching it in these ways. And finally, we've outlined a set of strategies around how investors that are leading in this area around IMM can act as a lighthouse for others. We think that there are many impact investors that are responding to and want to respond to some of the challenges we've been seeing around impact integrity and impact performance. And so we've outlined a range of ways in which we think that investors can support ventures, can show up among their peers, and to just be thoughtful in the way that IMM, as we reframed it, can actually be lived in practice and supported. what does this really look like in practice? Here's an example of the sailing phase. We heard from ventures that they might need tech-enabled tracking and rapid feedback loops. They might also want to have IMM more deeply integrated within all parts of their business. So in this case, investors can actually match some of those needs for ventures by funding specific tech infrastructure for integrated data systems. And they can also, in some cases, challenge ventures to keep impact at the center as they're scaling. So we've outlined these for each of the phases in terms of how investors can support the phase, but also the specific strategies depending on what the investor's positioning and contribution are. Many of you are familiar with the IMP's 5 dimensions. One of those includes contribution. And this is where we think IMM is such a key part of investor contribution, because it's not an isolated thing. It is related to the impact performance of ventures, and also is related to impact risk, to be able to reduce the probability, we believe, of impact risk when there is more alignment, as Laura said earlier. And to quickly outline some of the tools we have for investors, we have worksheets like this, and you can see that we've tried to tease out both the investor perspective as well as the venture perspective on one of these worksheets. And we think that these are helpful ways for both sides to actually have a very productive conversation around how to get at the right set of approaches, metrics, and tools. We've also included other worksheets where investors can look across their portfolio and try and identify where do the ventures in their portfolio sit in terms of their phase, and then how aligned are they in terms of the way that they're engaging around IMM. So in some cases, you want to provide quite hands-on support, maybe some tools, some resources. In other cases, you're going to be hands-off, or you're going to provide a very different set of contributions. And it's important to recognize that every investor might be capable of providing their own unique contribution. And we think that this is part of what impact investing is all about, in that every impact investor has their own preferences and contributions, but they should be explicit about them, and they should match what ventures are trying to address. So I hand it over now to Penny to talk about what this means for practitioners.
Yes, thanks, Karim. So we tried to bring to bear on this as well our experience as IMM practitioners and what we've learned. So putting that together with what we heard from the ventures and the investors. So one of the things we found is that there's often this tension between what investors need for their accountability purposes, so the information that they're looking for, and then on the other hand, what the ventures information needs are, and what information is going to be useful to them. So that tension can often be quite difficult. So where do IMM practitioners come in? Well, they bring the knowledge and skill that comes from that IMM practice to support and facilitate, I guess, a sort of an inquiry-oriented approach where ventures and investors can consider, how do we optimize for IMM, knowing that we've got a whole range of choices and different ways that we can do it and different things that we can measure. And so one way of doing that, and one example, is to find a few questions that will help guide through that consideration process. So one would be, what are those key questions that are going to get the information that's needed at that time, at that phase? How will that information be used? Who will use it, and for what purpose? So focusing down on a core set of questions. And then how does that fit with the current venture phase? So what would be a reasonable set of questions for that phase? What would be most useful to help navigate through that phase? And then what's the most feasible options out of all the possible tools and approaches that could be used for IMM? So considering things like availability of data, how much time is available, level of effort, and of course, quite importantly, the cost. Because every time you measure something, there is a cost to that. So some strategies that can be helpful in this, some kinds of approaches or tools, is the theory of change that's become quite prevalent recently. So a theory of change that sets out the impact pathway, and then a venture can locate themselves along that pathway And that helps to focus on what particular approach is going to be useful at that time, and what IMM choices there are that would be helpful at an early stage as well as later stages. So the other thing to do is, as we said earlier, that this is not a static thing. You don't grab a set of metrics and they'll do for the whole life cycle, if you like, of a venture. But it's important to iterate and review, as it is with a theory of change. But so review and further develop the IMM along that impact journey, and match the IMM to the actual phase that the venture's at, or in the light of new information that comes to hand and insights that are gained along that pathway. So as we mentioned earlier, this needs to be iterative and help the venture to adapt. Some of the things we've learned along the way, both from this project and beyond that, is that there are some pitfalls that it's worth avoiding. So committing to a fixed set of metrics that aren't particularly useful. They may have seemed to be a good thing to do at the beginning, but actually they're not adding value, and they're quite difficult to change. So once you put metrics in place in a measurement system, it does become quite difficult to shift that. Too many metrics is a very common problem. So less is more in this situation. So try and choose just a core set of metrics that are going to produce useful information. Misaligned metrics, as we've said before, can actually really get in the way and push things in the wrong direction and create impact risk. So what would good practice look like? Well, testing measurement methods early on, testing not only is it easy or difficult to get the data, but is the resulting information useful? And there is no one right way to do IMM. So if anyone comes to you and says, this is the gold standard, you have to do it this way, that's simply just not true. There is not a one size fits all for this. The trick is to match it to the information needs at that particular moment in time. So focusing on what's most relevant, what's most useful, and what's proportionate. So again, I mentioned cost, but it has to be proportionate to the resources that are available and the time that's available. So we've got a number of worksheets, as we've said, and IMM practitioners can use their experience and bring that to bear on this from other situations, other fields, if they seem relevant to the work at hand with a particular venture and for a particular investor. So I'll hand back to Karim.
Thanks, Penny. And so this is one of those examples of the investor worksheet, but we think that also practitioners could be using this. And we found in our experience working with different investor teams, so both LPs and GPs, so asset owners and asset managers, there are a range of beliefs around what impact is, what good data looks like, particularly those that are more steeped on financial analysis versus impact analysis. There might just be different levels of experience and beliefs around what IMM is. And as Penny said, there is no one universal or right way to do this, but it does have to be matched to the context. We found that also practitioners and ventures benefit from having a set of ways in which they can have the conversation more productively. We think that part of the reframing of IMM is really in service of trying to make this more decision useful and perhaps even more fun and interesting for everyone, rather than it feeling painful, complex, and not deriving enough value. So this is an example where for those of you that are practitioners or investors or even board members and IC members, you can use a tool like this and poll your peers and your colleagues and talk about the ways in which you understand what impact is, what IMM is, and then how that relates to the kinds of preferences and needs you have around what good looks like or how often you need certain kinds of information. So we've tried to respond to a set of the questions as they've come in, and I'll invite Laura and Penny to jump in a minute to elaborate on any of that. But just before they do, just want to share that the full guide, again, is available on immjourney.com. We did have a lot more content at the front end around reframing IMM. So for those of you for whom this is fairly new, we've got a lot of content, footnotes, etc., that you can look at that first section. There is a lot more also in each of the phases that we just weren't able to cover. So we've given you a bit of a preview for some of the phases, but within each phase, we've tackled a lot of different questions, challenges, inflection points, and each of the venture and investor worksheets are downloadable as part of the full guide, as well as a separate package on the website. These are interactive, so you can download them, fill them out. They're digitally enabled, and so you can share them digitally with your team and use those as a basis of discussion. So why don't I ask Laura if there's anything else you wanted to emphasize or follow up based on some of the questions that you've already responded to. There were some really good ones. So any other observations just based on what's come in so far?
Yeah, I guess a couple different things. There's been a really active Q&A, so really appreciate those of you who have chimed in and also shared your own reflections and experiences. I think some of the interesting things were this idea of looping. So Tanuja Prasad mentioned this idea of looping through the phases. And I think just want to emphasize that, yes, absolutely. We don't think about these phases as linear, passing through left to right. You might kind of be in a loop between orienting and navigating for quite some time, and your experiences in one will feed into the other phase. So just wanted to sort of say yes and underscore that. I think there are some other questions. A really interesting question Asghar put out is, could we apply the same phases to the investor journey and the investor's experience? And while I'll say we didn't really test that idea, and we didn't build the model based on what investors told us, I would hypothesize that some of the same patterns and recommendations would hold, of course, with some variations because different types of institutions. So I'd be actually curious from any investors in the audience whether the phases actually resonate one level up. And then there have been a couple of questions that have come in just about recommendations for, more technical recommendations about measurement in general, and what is good enough measurement for each phase, or what are recommendations about qualitative metrics and things like that. And I would say that, and perhaps this is a bit general, but overall, our recommendation is that the method you use should answer the question that's most important and the one that helps you make the decision. So maybe that's more qualitative, maybe that's less qualitative. We do offer in each of the phases sort of how to do it well. So some particular tips and tricks and what good can look like. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the measure of good is, did it help you make the decision you needed to make? So I think that's really the spirit with which we created this guide, is that measurement should help ventures make choices and make decisions that enhances their impact and their growth. So that is the measure of value and the measure of good, not some kind of academic standard for rigor, so much as a practical standard of usefulness.
Thanks, Laura. And I would add to that one of the things that this reiterated for us, and hopefully for all of you, is that while we do know that there's a lot of demand for more impact data and impact information from investors, and again, depending on the kind of investor you are, you might be getting more or less of those, and depending on whether you're LP or GP, that we wanted to reiterate that when ventures get value from IMM, investors will too. But the reverse is not necessarily true. In that simply placing more demands, if you're an investor, because you're responding to either regulation or your own demands for information and downloading those to the venture, may in fact hinder your relationship, the kind of value you get from IMM, and actually elevate potentially some of the impact risk. Now, these are things that we've heard and we've seen, but also require further testing. We think it's particularly important in this time when, on one hand, there's growing impact demand, activity, but also lots of standards and tools and then requirements for disclosure. There is a risk here that ventures are being forced to do too much or answer questions that are not appropriate or aligned with where they are. And so we hope that this kind of reframing, the tools and guidance that we provided, actually just help to make sure that those situations don't occur, in the way that we think potentially could, as more regulation, for example, kind of comes online over the next year or two. Penny, any final remarks or reflections on any of the questions that have come in so far before we hand it over to Annabelle?
Yes, I've just been typing in some further answers to the questions, so I'm still looking through them. But these are great questions, so thank you very much for those of you that have taken the time to put them in.
Okay, thanks, Penny. So I'd like to thank both Penny and Laura for both the webinar as well as all of their just amazing contributions over the course of this project. I'd also want to say that we'd love to hear from you. We know that many of you are doing this work or about to do this work or want to do it better. This is our attempt to essentially build the guide and toolkit that we hope others can benefit from, but it's one that we're using. And we'd love to hear how you're using it, how it can be improved. We've taken a lot of time to try and build out these worksheets in a way that would be interactive and useful. So please get in touch with us, visit the website, there's a contact us form, and we'd love to hear how you're using all of these tools and how we can improve them perhaps for the next version. And so with that, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Annabelle to wrap us up for this webinar.
Thanks so much, Karim, Laura, Penny. Some really interesting insights today, and I hope everyone took a lot of value from that. And those that asked questions, I hope you also found some value in those responses. We will send a recording out of the webinar in the next few weeks. It has been recorded and will also be added to YouTube. I've also attached a link in the chat for the information on all of our programs at the business school. So Karim's program, Impact Measurement, will be running this September. It's already proven to be quite popular. I think we've only got a couple of places left. So if you're interested, please do get in touch. But it also sits in a portfolio of 4 programs focused on impact. So we also look at impact investing, social finance, and impact finance innovations. So if you'd like to learn more, please get in touch. Or equally, if you'd like more information on the webinars or any of the social impact content that we release, please also get in touch. We can add you to our mailing list. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you're coming from today.